I'm the president of South Island Sea Kayaking, and it's our meeting, but we are sharing the meeting tonight with BC Marine Trails, and I'm really happy to have BC Marine Trails, period. I mean, they're such a great organization, a great mission, and they're doing a great job of it. And we're happy to have them on tonight. So I wanted to start by just introducing, and if you would just say something, unmute yourself and say something. Paul Gray, Paul's out there somewhere. There's Paul, he's making noise.
Yeah, thanks. I thought I put myself in speaker view. I'm just the president of the BC Marine Trails, do a lot of volunteer work on mapping and website development and planning trips with our stewardship coordinator and just lots of tasks. So thanks for hosting the event tonight. So.
Oh, you're most welcome. Glad you guys could be here. So can we just have anybody who's on the Marine Trails board and is on line? Could you just unmute yourself and say hi? I see a few.
Hello, it's Gina.
Yeah, hi Gina.
Nice to see you again, Alan.
Good to see you. Anybody else?
Nick Heath, I'm here. Hi everyone.
Hi, Nick.
Hello, I'm Karina Young. Nice to see everybody.
Hi, Karina. Okay, and okay, so that's great. And then we don't normally do this, but maybe because we have a joint meeting going on, it might be useful. I introduced myself, but we actually have a number of other executive or board members for Siska Online. Maybe if you just unmute yourself if you're a Siska board member and say hi. That's
Debbie, I'm a director at large.
Debbie waving, and Roger, or Deb said that, and Roger is waving. I guess he doesn't do the vocal thing.
Hi, I'm Delcy McClellan, and I'm the secretary of Siska.
Thanks, Delcy.
And hi, I'm Lynn Beek. I'm the vice president. Welcome, everyone.
Great. Okay, I think that may have it. Roger's a bit shy. Roger Botting is our treasurer. Very important guy. Okay, so wanted to just start that way. And then what we're going to do, just to give you an idea, it won't take too long. I have a few, we do have a few announcements to make, just some Siska business. I'll do that. Then I'll turn it over to Paul. Paul might have some brief announcements too about Marine Trails. And then I'm going to ask Paul if he would introduce our speaker for tonight, who you'll see online as Liam Reagan. Liam works for Marine Trails as their First Nations liaison, and he's doing the presentation tonight on Salish seabirds and First Nations. And then we'll have, go through the presentation, which I've had a chance to, see a bit of with Liam. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And we'll finish that up. I think Fred's going to come on, our meetings coordinator, who's also our Marine Trails director for the island and works with Marine Trails for us. And so Fred will come on at that point, and then I'll end the session. So that's how it'll go. It'll be, usually it's about an hour and a half that it takes all together. I hope you can stay with us, and especially for Liam's presentation. We are recording this in case you weren't aware. We the fellow up there who says it's got Heather in front of him, that's Tony Playfair, Tony and Heather. So Tony is going to recording this, and he'll post it on our YouTube channel afterwards, which you can find from our website public homepage under general interest. So that's how it's going to go. Let me just get started and won't take too long, hopefully. Debbie has a couple of quick announcements. Go ahead, Deb.
Hey, there's a couple of on-water and off-water clinics just to be a heads up on. If you're thinking about camping and want to make smart gear choices, on Tuesday, March 1st, we're doing a Zoom with recommendations from experienced Siska campers on their favorite things to take camping. And I'm encouraging people to bring their own favorite piece of gear to show off at Show and Tell on Tuesday the 1st at 7 o'clock. And In June, we'll be having a session for first aid, paddle and practice. So for people that have taken the first aid course and are thinking you need to do a little brush up with some practical skills, we've got Mike Barnes from Alert First Aid going to have a paddle day and practice first aid scenarios with Lee Richardson as his assistant. So that's in June 11th on a Saturday. So those are a couple of clinics for you.
Great, thank you very much, Debbie. And I'll just ask Jenny if she has anything to announce. Jenny, are you there?
I'm unmuted and
There you
here I
go.
am.
Yep.
Yeah, so the Siska instructors that are members of Siska have, we've set up 2 level 1 Paddle Canada courses. The early March one is full, but if those dates work, you could register on the wait list for that. And the one that still has space is it's over 2 weekends, March 20th and March 27th with Allison. Now, I just realized tonight that the Paddle Canada clinics are not showing up on the calendar, but they are listed under clinics and courses. And supposedly that's going to be fixed, but you can find it there to register and pay. More people, I can contact more people, and I will be sending out an email. So if you're interested, act quickly and get registered and pay. Thanks.
Great, thank
And
you.
thanks to the instructors, because it's a volunteer job they're doing. So.
Mhm. Okay, thanks very much. I have referred to me, BJ's not with us tonight. She couldn't be here, but BJ Porter, one of our directors and keen paddler. She's so keen, she wants to do now her Paddle Canada level 3. And so she's been out there shopping around. She's found a course with Ocean River, May 6th to 10th. I believe it's Jordy Newman Allen, who's the main lead of that. And it's in Victoria, starts in Victoria and goes on to Port Renfrew. And what she would like is if there's anybody else interested in doing their level 3, to give her a shout, let her know, because they need so many in order to make the course viable, and she wants it to go. So if that works for you or you're interested, you can contact BJ, and BJ is one of our directors. I think it's director 1 at siska.ca, or just look under our contacts and you'll see her listed there, and send her a note and she'd be happy to let you know what she does about Paddle Canada level 3 course that she's hoping to take in early May. And then I will just give a bit of a pitch here. We had some email exchanges before the meeting. Many of you will know that we have our annual general meeting coming up in April. And so that's a couple of months away, but not too far ahead for us to be advertising for, help. So those of you who are interested in playing a role in the way Siska operates, and if you enjoy what we do and you'd like to help us continue to do it, we're looking for volunteers. So and I'm not saying we are without candidates, but we're always happy to have more. We are looking for a new secretary starting in April for our board, and a new treasurer. That's why Roger looks so self-satisfied up there, because he's finished his second 2-year term, as has Delcy, as of this coming AGM. So if you're interested in either of those positions, you can contact me or any other member of the board and learn more about them. We'd be happy to talk to you. By the way, that isn't the only thing. We also have 3 directors at large. 2 of them this time around are reaching the end of their first 2-year term. They can elect to go for a second 2-year term, and I have a hunch they will, because we're treating them so well. But if you are interested, we'd love to hear from you. So please, again, contact any member of the board if you're interested in being a director at large. And then my final pitch is this, and anybody who's involved with volunteer organizations will know, you never have too many volunteers. You can see how we operate as a club here at Siska. We've got a whole bunch of people who do a bunch of things. if you're interested in any of these leadership roles, then please let us know. And what I'm thinking is it would be great for you to connect with the person who has the role now, even if they're planning to stay in it, you know, help them out, be a bit of an assistant or whatever, get your feet wet if that's something that appeals to you. Now, I understand not everybody likes to do that, and that's just fine too. We're here for all our members, but you know, with as many members as we have, we're pretty sure there's some talent out there that would love to get an opportunity to be doing some things for the club. So anyway, give us a shout, and that's my pitch. I will leave it there. I'll just ask quickly, is there any other, for Siska, any other announcements that I've missed? No. Okay, then I will turn it over to Paul, but just before I do that, I want to say we have our next meeting is March 23rd. Of course, it's a fourth Wednesday of each month. And then on April, I think it's April 27th is our AGM. We are looking at, we've been doing Zoom now for 2 years, believe it or not, 2 years. And we are looking at having an in-person meeting for March 23rd. Those of you who live in Victoria or know Victoria, we're in the process of concluding a contract with the Garth Homer Society. They have a very large auditorium space we think would be a comfortable space for us transitioning back to in-person meetings. So just something to bear in mind, think ahead about, and you'll be hearing more about that in due course. And then we'd hope to have our AGM in person as well in April, but we'll see how things go. We're obviously going to do what's safe, and hope that that suits many of you, and we'll continue to provide a recording for you as well. And now, Paul, if you have announcements, please take it away.
Sure. So thanks for the welcome again from Ellen, and admire the way that Siska's organized. It's quite impressive. Just recently, we rebranded ourselves with new logos, ideas, and directions, building a new website and mapping system. So we're slowly making changes to the map to accommodate paddlers' wishes. And one of the big changes is the member map and the public map work on a mobile phone. And it has a new trip planning tool as well, like so you can draw your route and save it to a GPX, which is a type of file that works on your GPS unit. So actually, Gina and I are been working the last couple of days in connecting our map sites directory, where there's a list of displayed sites with images, and we're going to link that from our pop-up boxes. We're just running through tests at the moment. And some stewardship activities we're doing, like a section 57 on Francisco to add a couple of tent sites there. Later may work on Vargas Island with House It and the House It High School. We're also working with the surf riders. And we got Karina on board here tonight, a director, and she's the main coordinator for World Oceans Week in June. And it looks like we're going to have to do Gerald Island in September. They forbid us to go there in April. Just recently said we'd trample the plants. So we have to abide by BC Parks' wishes. It's really quite interesting. Our code of conduct is moving into a pilot stages, and we're going to be working with the Sea Kayak Guides Alliance and a couple of businesses. We've made some recent changes to our code to make it more practical, you might say, and we've analyzed it through a system of actually from a Siska member. It's called community-based social marketing, which examines barriers and benefits, and we're making changes and basing our work on that. We're also got a contest coming up. We'll announce it in April's newsletter. We got 3 pretty good prizes from Mustang Survival, and I believe at that time we're going to introduce a new app for site condition reports that work on your phone off or online. So that's just quickly some of the stuff that we're doing in the next month or so. Great.
Thank you, Paul. Paul, now can I call on you to introduce Liam?
Sure. Liam Reagan. He's graduated from McGill University in anthropology and environmental studies. He works in First Nations engagement for the BC Marine Trails as a liaison, working with over 30 nations, it's fairly complex work. And he is also the provincial coordinator for an important bird and diversity areas under the BC Nature and Birds Canada. So Liam's an avid birder, photographer, and a conservationist. So I'd like to welcome Liam tonight.
Hey folks, thanks for the introduction, Paul, and thanks, Alan. I'm going to share my screen now and get back from you if it's working properly. Can everyone see that and not my speaker notes?
Yep.
Fantastic, that's what I like to hear. In that case, yeah, it's been said a couple times now, but thank you, Siska, for hosting us. It's really great to have this audience. I recognize a few friends, a few coworkers, a few family members, and really grateful to have everyone here today. Again, so yeah, my name is Liam. I'm the First Nations liaison for BC Marine Trails, which is a not-for-profit which promotes safe, sustainable, and respectful paddling throughout the coast of BC, just in case anyone wasn't aware. Part of that sustainability mandate has been that we've sought funding from the Trans-Canada Trail, who allowed us to do this research into paddler guidelines around seabirds and present this, or do this presentation, everyone. So thank you to them. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And before we begin, I wanted to quickly acknowledge that I live here in Victoria on the territory of the Lekwungen and Wisanic speaking peoples. Going a little bit further, I know sometimes territorial acknowledgements are, a little bit quick and easy. I've done my best to include at least one story of how First Nations have interacted with each of the different groups of birds I'll be talking about today. This is a incredibly understudied field. And so to avoid repeating, this was an important source of meat and feathers and eggs 7 times, we also draw some anecdotes down from the Inuit and the areas outside of the Salish Sea. But overall, I think it's all pretty interesting stuff that people are gonna find as interesting as I found it. So what to expect from the talk. We will be going over real quick who I am, a quick intro into what the Salish Sea is and what makes it so important for birds, go through 6 different groups of species with a focus on where they can be found, what they look like, what their diversity is, First Nations aspects of that, and their conservation status. And then lastly, we'll look at birds and paddlers. So how paddlers can ensure they don't disturb seabirds, and furthermore, how paddlers can go above and beyond to help support conservation of those seabirds. So a quick bit about me, aka why bother listening to this guy? I was born in Vancouver, raised in Nairobi, went to school in Montreal, currently living in Victoria. I already mentioned all the stuff about my work, but just to quickly add on to why I know a little bit about birds, I'm the provincial coordinator for the Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas program with BC Nature and Birds Canada. That basically looks to designate every area in BC where 1% of a global or national population of a species occur, so we can just pay extra attention and have our volunteer caretakers monitor that. With regards to how much I actually bird, I was trying to run in some stats to figure out how much do I actually bird, and found that I have currently logged, as of writing this, 2,703 hours into eBird, which is about a third of a year straight since 2018. So I don't know, for whatever that's worth. I spend a lot of time thinking about birds, and I hope that's reflected here. So a bit about what the Salish Sea is. This shouldn't come as a surprise to most of you here. In fact, I imagine almost everyone here understands what the Salish Sea is as a paddler far better than I do as a birder. But it's an international estuarian system made up of marine waters and upland watershed, home to 9 million people. It's both a global biodiversity and cultural hotspot. There are numerous languages and cultural groups in the area. There's also 37 species of mammals, 172 species of birds, and 253 species of fish, which I found quite incredible considering I could probably name 4 or 5 at most. So certainly a hole in my knowledge. With regards to why it's important to birds, the best way to put it is really that it is part of the Pacific Flyway, which is a continental migratory pathway which over 1 billion birds fly through every year, both spending the winter breeding, but more importantly, moving safely from wintering grounds as far south as Argentina to where they breed up in the high Arctic and Alaska. So that's the Salish Sea in a nutshell. So like I said, we're going to be looking at 6 groups of birds. Excuse my horrific Photoshop attempt to represent them all in one image. As you can imagine, these 6 birds species do not typically hang out all together in one nice spot for me to photograph, much to my chagrin. The 6 groups are alcids, so guillemots, puffins, things like that, cormorants, grebes, loons, waterfowls, which are comprised of ducks and geese, and then gulls and terns. Those weren't chosen arbitrarily. Those are all taxonomic groups. So these are all, closely related evolutionary groups with similar survival strategies, breeding strategies, the like, that might respond similarly to paddlers. So first off, alcids, as I said, this comprises of merlets, guillemots, puffins. Here, I thought the best intro photo would be this marbled merlet I saw here in Victoria, which was taking advantage of a limited herring spawn back in 2021. A quick rundown of which ones you can find in the Salish Sea. There are 10 species that have occurred, though only 5 of these are regulars. All 5 who you'll likely run into while paddling. So that includes the common mer, pinna guillemot, marbled merlet, rhinoceros auklet, and ancient merlet. These other ones, if you do run into, please let me know, because there will be a lot of birders hopping on kayaks and boats to come see it right after you. To get a sense of kind of when they're using the Salish Sea, I've pulled from eBird data for the Capital Regional District to show when they're being seen throughout the year, to kind of show how different species use the area in the Salish Sea throughout the year. As you can see here, there's a bit of a split between species which use the Salish Sea to safely overwinter, have places to eat, so ancient merlet, and species that are here year-round and breed, so for example, pigeon guillemot. But that's all boring. It doesn't have photos. So I thought maybe I could do a bit better than that. Using that same platform I mentioned, eBird, they've actually produced these incredible maps based on millions of just people going out and saying what they saw. So I'll turn this on. Like I said, pigeon guillemot. You can see here by abundance and time of year, spent a lot of time in the Salish Sea before into the summer, moving up into the Arctic, up into Alaska, breeding, moving all about, and then coming back into the Salish Sea around November. You'll hear me say eBird a lot during this presentation. I'm a huge fan, and I really appreciate that they give us free resources like this, because I can say pigeon guillemot are here this time of year, or I can show you on a map, and so there'll be a few more of these. Let me see if I can go through this without triggering the video again. I cannot, but there we go. So what are alcids? They're marine specialists that breed primarily on rocky islands and cliffs, with one exception that we'll get to. They spend their winters entirely at sea, hardly ever coming onto land, I don't think at all, really, for most. And they feed on everything from zooplankton to squid, so pretty diverse diet, though not the most diverse of what we'll talk about today. People often refer to them as flying footballs because they fly really fast, typically in a straight line, can't turn very well, and are much more comfortable in the water than they are on land. As for their conservation, they're a fairly at-risk group. 29% of, 7 out of 25 of the species on Earth are at risk in some way. So 2 near threatened, 3 vulnerable, 2 endangered. And that's largely a result of habitat destruction, climate change, introduced nesting predators, so rats and cats on islands that they formerly nested on. And here specifically in the Salish Sea, depleting fish stocks, which again, we'll talk a bit more about. There's also one species which is extinct, which obviously I don't have a photo of for that reason, the great auk. So they're a group of birds that are not doing so well, that could definitely use a little more help. But overall, we still get good numbers of them, and there's still a lot of hope for their future populations. Like I said, I'm trying to incorporate a First Nations element into every one of these, and of all of them, this is one of my favorites. Started on a strong note. So when I was researching how different First Nations have interacted with alcids, puffins came up pretty prominently. Unfortunately, we don't have many puffins in the Salish Sea. They'll wander in once in a blue moon, but it's a pretty rare occurrence. But up towards Haida Gwaii, they're much more common because they breed up there. And what I found was nations up there, such as the Haida and the Tlingit, view puffins as sort of spiritual messengers between the tangible world and the spirit world, because of their ability to be going along the water, turn on a dime, and immediately dive and kind of move between those worlds. And so as part of that, in the fall, when the puffins have finished breeding, they'll actually shed that really bright, colorful bit on the front of their bill. And the Haida and Tlingit will be able to go collect those and turn them into rattles. And so these rattles, like you see here, are then used in ceremony to just depict, again, that kind of spiritual messenger role that they have in their culture. I tried so hard. I reached out to so many museums being like, do you have a recording of one of these things being shaken? And they said, shake it. God, no, it's an antique. And I said, but it's a rattle. Like, come on. So we don't have that, but I can at least show you pictures. And by God, if I find a recording, I will share it with Siska immediately. So as I mentioned, they breed on coastal or rocky cliffs and islands, except for, and many of you may have already guessed it, marbled murrelet. I'll do a little case study of these guys to kind of give a better sense rather than just the broad, here's what else it is. But this is actually the last species in North America that we figured out where they nest. I say we, it was before I was born. But essentially, people were looking up in the Arctic, people were looking out in tundra, people were looking all over the place. We had no idea where they went to in the summer. And then a logger down in, I think, Oregon or Washington was climbing an old growth and came on a seabird and reached out to his friends and said, what the hell? And they all said, no, you didn't find a seabird in a tree. That's not possible. And so finally someone went out, checked it out. And yeah, they nest in old growth where there, as you can imagine, are much fewer predators. But as a result of this, they are not doing so well. They are listed as endangered. So one of the most endangered alcids on the planet. That's largely as a result of old growth logging. Only 2.7% of old growth in BC remains, as I'm sure many of you have seen from many of the reports that have come out. And of that 2.7%, much of that old growth are spruce bogs and much kind of smaller, different habitats that aren't of use to marbled murrelets. They're also exceedingly susceptible to oil spills because of their propensity to spend a huge amount of time right at the waterline. And so, for example, the Alaskan Exxon Valdez spill back in, when would that have been, 90s, give or take? That was estimated to have killed 2% of the entire global population. So they're a bird that's incredibly adaptable, as evidenced by the fact I'm showing you one a couple hundred feet up in an old growth tree, but also at risk. As I mentioned, they really, really like herring spawns, as do many of the birds we'll be talking about today. Here's that same photo I showed before. Because of that, they are at risk from inshore gill netting. Many of them will get caught up in fishermen's nets, and that's something that the province is working actively to combat. So that's alcids in a nutshell. I'm going to move on to cormorants now, but I wanted to quickly say, if people have questions, please type them up in the chat. We're going to have, I've tried to set out a good amount of time for questions near the end of this. And yeah, so put those in the chat. So next, cormorants. What is a cormorant? We have 3 species of cormorant here in BC, Brandt's cormorant, pelagic cormorant, and double-crested cormorant. Double-crested are kind of like the biggest one. They have that bright orange facial patch. They occur all across North America, both inland and on the water. Pelagic are my personal favorite. They're kind of the skinny iridescent cousin with their thin bills, red faces during the breeding season, and overall kind of luminescent feathering. And then Brandt's cormorant, which are of the 3 the hardest to find, but certainly around, particularly in the winter. They have that bright blue facial patch while breeding, and can sometimes aggregate in the thousands in places like Active Pass during winter, where they're catching a quick bite. So speaking of seasons, same as before, here is what we were able to see about when they're occurring in the Salish Sea. As you can see, like I said, double-crested and pelagic here all year round, slightly fewer during the breeding season and more coming through in winter. And then Brandt's cormorant stick around in smaller numbers throughout the year, but particularly in winter. So identification, what is a cormorant? At this point, I thought, for no real reason, I'd throw in this video I took the other day in Sydney of one scratching itself for a minute straight, because why not? Cormorants are found throughout the world. They're found on not every continent, sorry. They're not found on Antarctica, I don't believe. And they are aquatic specialists, usually preferring marine waters, with a few exceptions, such as the double-crested cormorant we were talking about. They dive underwater, catch fish with their long hooked bills, and surprisingly are not all that waterproof. Because of that, that's why you'll often see them on piers, such as in this video, where they're essentially trying to dry off, spread their wings out, get dry again so they can stay warm. And yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But overall, conservation-wise, their populations are fairly stable. Double-crested cormorants are increasing throughout North America, while pelagic and brants are slightly decreasing, mostly as a result of nest disturbance, reduced fish stocks, and climate change. But overall, all of these are least concern by Kosiwik, and they're doing fairly well. So no more doom and gloom for this presentation. So I can move on without starting that video again. I cannot. One a little bit farther away, but one thing I love to share about cormorants. For anyone who hasn't heard, in East and Southeast Asia, fishermen have actually been able to train them to fish for them, basically by tying, and I'm not 100% sure the logistics of this, so if anyone here is a East or Southeast Asian traditional fisherman, please don't mock me too hard for my lack of knowledge. I haven't been there. But they're able to tie a rope around the cormorant's neck such that when they catch the fish, they don't swallow them immediately. And then in exchange for fishing for them, they're given protection from predators and also given some of the fish to eat, which is just something that blows me away every day. But at any rate, for the First Nations aspect, I was able to find two really interesting things about cormorant. One, as you can imagine, they were eaten by many nations along the coast. Though interestingly, many nations as well had cultural taboos around them, usually because, quote, they're tough and disgusting. I haven't eaten a cormorant, so I don't know. But the way that they hunted them was really interesting. One of the ways of just netting them, that was fairly standard. But with cormorants, some of the ways that Coast Salish First Nations would hunt them would be by getting in two-man canoes and having one person paddle while the other lights a small fire inside the canoe and goes right up to a cormorant colony. When the fire comes close, the cormorants aren't really sure where the light's coming from. They're not sure what's going on. And they start flying around. And because it's so dark, they don't really have a great sense of avoiding the canoe, and the Coast Salish were able to harpoon them out of the air or even just grab them with their bare hands. Now, if you can read the caption on that, these are actually salmon harpoons. Like I said, this is a very research deficient area, and so I wasn't able to find examples of cormorant harpoons, but I just wanted to share this to show how kind of incredibly specialized each of the tools the Coast Salish were using for gathering things like cormorants and salmon and all that are. So yeah. And then the other really cool thing I found, again, not from the Salish Sea, was that apparently cormorants make really good waterproof parkas for the Inuit and the Yupik. So this one is actually a Yupik parka made out of bleached seal gut, auklet crests, so a type of alcid, and cormorant feathers. And just to get a close-up of that, because it's just, I think, astounding. Here it is again. You can see, I tried to give a bit of perspective. A crested auklet here on the right, those are what make up all those tassels, while on the left, the pelagic cormorant, that is, I believe, the lining on the hood. Again, there wasn't much written up about this piece. It's a ceremonial parka, so it wouldn't be used to fend off the cold so much as for rituals and things like that. But yeah, I thought a really cool use and something I never would have imagined a cormorant would be much good for. But what do I know? I've never even eaten one. So next we have grebes. For this one, I chose a redneck grebe. They're one of my favorites. They're just gangly looking and odd, as we'll kind of get to. Here in the Salish Sea, we have 6 species of grebe. The 3 are you can expect to find while paddling. That's the horned grebe, the redneck grebe, and the western grebe. Pied-billed grebe are common. They're just more inland and on freshwater. Clark's grebe and ear grebe are fairly rare around here. Again, they have a diversity of strategies that they use the Salish Sea for, though predominantly very few breed here. I don't believe any of the species we've talked about, though pied-billed do inland. And the others spend migration and winter here for kind of safe stopover points and easy snacks, more or less. So as for what a grebe is, they are aquatic specialists that are found on lakes and oceans, especially in the southern hemisphere. Many of them prefer lakes seemingly, and yeah, they build floating nests out of reeds and were a traditional source of winter protein for First Nations along the coast. So this is something I found really interesting. A lot of First Nations similar to cormorants didn't eat grebes because they found them fairly distasteful. They were quite a bit more preferred for prairie First Nations, where their skins were used for medicine pouches and ceremony. But here on the coast, one of the ways that some First Nations would harvest them is by roasting them over a fire on a spit and collecting the fat that renders off of them in birch bark trays. and then funneling that into sacks like this that were made out of dried salmon skin so that they could be stored and used in the winter when protein was a bit more scarce. This wouldn't be the exact type that would have been used. That's, I couldn't find a photo of a grebe storing salmon skin, but I thought I should just share this because the image that popped into my mind was of some sort of dry salmon sock, which is obviously not correct. The next thing I wanted to share about them is what I find incredibly interesting, which is that their feet are set very far back on their bodies, which mean they're incredible swimmers, but incredibly gangly on land. And I could explain that in terms of not aerodynamics, you know what I mean, exactly how that works. Or I could show you a side-by-side of how they're graceful in water. Don't worry, we're not watching the whole thing, just a snippet from it.
Only the strongest and the most faithful are prepared to join together for the final exultant dance.
So those were Western and Clark's grebes doing their courtship dance, which I think really shows how good they are, or how effective they're in the water with their legs. But then at the same time, the trade-off of that is this. Oh, nope.
Only the strongest.
Next. The trade-off of that is on land, they look a bit more like this. For anyone wondering the reason the shutter was going so fast there, that's not my video, by the way, that's from YouTube, is because this is a pretty rare sight to see a grebe walking. They can't do it very well. It's the trade-off they make for being so ludicrously agile in the water. Really quickly, or just a thumbs up in chat or something. Can people hear the audio coming from my computer? I want to make sure. There was David Attenborough there, who obviously narrates much better than I can. Perfect.
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. Because I have more audio coming up for loons, as you might imagine. So loons. This one's a common loon from right near my grandparents' house on Saginaw Lake. Funnily enough, I think my grandparents are tuned in from Saginaw Lake right now. So maybe they can look out and see the same loon. I don't know. There are 5 species of loons around the world, all of which can, I say can, be found in the Salish Sea, though some of them, were you to find, would be incredibly rare and get birders around BC very, very excited, namely Arctic loon. The 3 species that we get regularly in the Salish Sea are the Pacific loon, the red-throated loon, and the common loon. Just to quickly talk about what makes them different, common loon are ID'd by having their huge, huge bill, often found inland more so than the other loons, and have that dark, dark black head. Pacific loon have the gray nape. Don't worry about telling apart Arctic loon and Pacific loon for now. Like I said, these guys are quite a bit rarer, and even people who spend a lot of time doing this struggle to tell them apart. But it doesn't really matter unless you're in the high Arctic. So not something people need to worry about on an everyday basis. And then lastly, the red-throated loon, so the one up here. You might be tricked by thinking, oh, it'd be easy to idea. It has a red throat, but when they're in BC, typically because they're not breeding, they look a little bit grayer, a little bit less extravagant, and so you can ID them by their tiny little bill, slender necks, and yeah, if you do see them with the red throat, you're quite lucky. I've only seen it a few times. It's pretty special. With regards to usage strategies in the Salish Sea, as you can see, they predominantly spend the winter in migration here, with the exception of common loon, which sticks around in some numbers through the summer. I think there's a couple that breed around the area, but not many. They prefer deeper lakes and going farther north and inland. And as for what a loon actually is, they're fish specialists. so eat almost exclusively fish with the odd frog or insect thrown in, particularly chicks. They like to feed smaller insects and things like that to their young. Of the 5 species, all are considered least concern by the IUCN, except for yellow-billed loon, which is near threatened. And 3 of their species, or 3 of their populations, are considered to be declining. Similar to grebes, their legs are right by the back of their bodies, which mean they can't walk very well. And their movement on land has been described more as tobogganing than walking. I'm not going to make you sit through a whole bunch of videos of loons acting uncomfortable. I feel it would be doing them pretty dirty on that, considering how graceful and incredible they are. But because they can't walk on land, one really interesting adaptation is that they will build their nests no more than 1 body length away from water, if not on floating reeds on the water, so that they don't have to walk around. And as soon as the chicks hatch, they come onto the water and they'll ride on their parents' backs so they can stay where they're more comfortable. They are, going back to conservation, shown to be at high risk of human disturbance, namely motorized boat wakes causing their nests to flood, lead sinkers from fishing being consumed by them and leading to them being poisoned, and flooding through climate change, increasing both the risks to their nests, but also particularly out east, populations of black fly, which will bite them and suck blood during the breeding season. And in some cases have been shown to lead to pretty high rates of nest failure. And so, like I said, the majority of them are least concerned. They're doing well for now, but again, it's one of those ones that we like to keep close tabs on. Birds Canada, who I'll talk about more later, has a really, really effective loon lake monitoring program where basically volunteers submit 3 reports a year saying, yes, there's loons on my lake, here's how they're doing, et cetera, et cetera. And that's helped us to be able to say, least concern, okay, they're still doing okay. We don't need to hit the panic button yet, but let's keep tabs. Before I move on, I thought it would be ridiculous to talk about loons and not give a little bit of audio. So here's a recording of, I think, this exact same loon in the photo, but I could be wrong. So as I said, that is the same loon that I was photographing around my grandparents' place on Saginaw Lake. So shout out to that loon, really, really helped my presentation. With regards to the First Nation significance of loons, this is one where there was no shortage of information. As you can imagine, large, charismatic, sometimes tasty bird across all of North America or most of North America, has a lot of different significances to many different First Nations. Interestingly, most nations I could find information on fell on either side of they're delicious, I love them. So for example, the Cree in Northern Quebec, loon fat dumplings were apparently a delicacy that was, really highly sought after. And others which really disliked the taste and said absolutely not, either because they taste really bad or because of cultural held beliefs around loons and their relationships to peoples and communities. Particularly in the Arctic, interestingly, many Inuit and Yupik groups consider them a starvation food that were only to be eaten in cases of absolute dire kind of, worst case scenario. Similar to how the cormorants were hunted, they would be hunted in the Salish Sea by 2-man canoe teams with one person paddling and the other wielding a harpoon in the front. The hunters would also be able to mimic loon calls like the one I just played and use shiny bits of objects to kind of flash light at them. And the loons would come over and then be easy to harpoon. They had numerous uses for, again, numerous nations. Pretty much every part of the loon I could find was used. So their down was used for blankets and pillows. Their feathers were sought after as really effective brooms. And their bills, being incredibly hard and meant for kind of stabbing at fish, were used as arrowhead tips by some nations. I couldn't find photos of this. If anyone happens to have photos of this, I would be unimaginably eager to see, because I can't picture it, and it sounds really cool. And yeah, let me see. So the mask that I'm showing here is actually of Inuit origin, Inuit origin. Because loons are considered in Inuit culture as forebringers of rain and storms. And so many masks are based off of loons. This is one of the more prominent ones I found, and I thought just stunning. And And yeah, let's see. Not to be outdone by grebes, I did find this video of a diver in Minnesota who was able to get footage of one swimming from below. I realized leading up to the talk this morning that I was maybe preaching to the wrong group, and that you folks being paddlers do all you can to not get this view of loons and stay above water. But nonetheless, you can really see here how having the legs set so far back in the body make for really easy swimming and ease of catching fish. So I thought that was something cool and worth sharing. Let's see. All right. We're just about through the groups, and then we'll be talking about, again, how paddlers can relate to birds, how they can avoid disturbing them, things like that. So hopefully this isn't too dry. I tried to put in enough videos, sounds, the like. But like I said, waterfowl break down into ducks and geese. This here is a photo of Brant up at Island View here in Victoria. A lot of my photos are in Victoria, but as a result of moving here during the pandemic, I didn't get to travel around the island as much as I'd hoped, but that's luckily changing now. Waterfowl are incredibly diverse. Globally, there's around 174 species, ranging from everything from Canada geese to surf scoters to eiders to a blind Hawaiian mole duck that couldn't fly and lived in burrows and is now extinct. So they live in pretty much every body of water you can find around the globe. I have had incredibly successful diversification and are a really interesting group. As for what makes them waterfowl, like I said, exceedingly diverse, found on every continent, broad habitat preferences. They eat pretty well anything you can imagine: plants, insects, crustaceans, fish, animals, depending on the species. And they have been, let me see, hunted and domesticated by humans for thousands and thousands of years. The photo here is one from an Egyptian tomb 4,500 years ago, and shows side by side a painting of a red-breasted goose in the back, and in the front what archaeologists think might be an extinct species of goose. They're not sure, which I thought was really interesting. But yeah, they've been used for everything from food to domestication to sources of down to status symbols by the Roman Empire, since really as far back as we have records. As for a little bit closer to home, I thought it would be good to give an example of something we're all probably a little more familiar with than red-breasted geese, which is Canada geese. As some of you may or may not know, we actually have multiple populations of Canada geese. There are the dusky ones, which you see here in the bottom, which are native to the Pacific Northwest. They spend the winters here, they breed up in the high Arctic, and they'll migrate through and winter in small numbers through here. A lot of them go down to Washington. And then top, you have I forget the name of the population, but essentially the introduced population of Canada geese. They're a bit of a problem because they don't migrate. They're very aggressive, and they will eat grass beds down to nothing, including marine grass beds. Many First Nations have found, and marine biologists have found, that where their populations take off, they'll actually eat down eelbed grass until salmon and other organisms can't really benefit from it. And the reason I bring this up is that here on Vancouver Island and nearby, First Nations have been really proactive in kind of being the first line of defense against some of these introduced populations of Canada geese. So the Comox and the Tla'amin, because they have experience, working with hunting waterfowl, things like that, have actually led the charge on ethically hunting and consuming these invasive geese so that they can hold space for other species which do nest here and which get kind of pushed off their grounds by these introduced populations of Canada geese. So that's something really interesting. Also, I should add, don't take this into your own hands. There's really great organizations doing everything from egg addling to supporting First Nations efforts. But yeah, just to let you know, I thought that was a really kind of cool and contemporary way that First Nations are working to manage geese populations. Another one of those maps I was mentioning that really show how different species use the Salish Sea. This one's surf scoter, so you can see her over on the right. I imagine as paddlers, you're all quite familiar with surf scoter. And as you can see, they're found throughout North America and really spend the winter along both coasts. But then as summer goes on, all spread out into the high Arctic to breed. before coming back in September, October-ish, and really densifying around the coasts. Some of my Birds Canada colleagues who I saw were actually on this call were recently sharing a video where there were, I don't know, somewhere in the range of 1,000 of just a constant train of surf scoters off of Vancouver going by. So this is really, really important habitat for them. And yeah, so I can move forward without watching this again. Another species with a similar strategy are harlequin duck, which again, I imagine you're all fairly familiar with. Similarly, they spread out along the coast in the winter, move up into the high Arctic for the summer, and then move back down. We get really high abundance of them here around Vancouver Island. They're a really cool species. And one of the reasons they actually spend their time on the coast is that once they finish breeding on their interior whitewater rivers and things like that, they will come down to the coast and molt their flight feathers. So switch out all their feathers to kind of get rid of the stress of breeding and make sure they're ready to go for the next season. When they do this, they're actually flightless for about a give or take 2-week period and really susceptible to disturbance from boats, from predators, things like that. I just bring that up because we're going to talk about it a little bit more in the next section with paddlers, but it's a really interesting strategy. Watch that one more time, just I love watching these maps. Again, they kind of move into the interior for a flash to breed. You can see here, up and down the Rockies, up into the high Arctic. And yeah. Let's see. All right, so that's waterfowl. Next we have gulls and terns. This is a glaucous wing gull that I got to photograph when we were up on Denman, actually in February of 2020, with my first and only BCMT paddling trip when we were there for the herring spawn. Much to my chagrin, we have yet to be able to do one since with the pandemic and all, but as we'll talk about later here, we're hoping to do something similar with Siska to do a bit of a bird watching paddle sometime in April, give or take. But anyway, I digress. So again, gulls are quite a diverse group. These are just some of the species that have been seen in the Salish Sea. Again, these are things that have been seen. Some of these are fairly rare and would be quite exceptional were they to show up again. Yeah. As for what makes a gull and a tern, I found a very good definition for gull versus tern, which was essentially that gulls generally eat any animal they can swallow, dead or alive, with astonishing opportunism and ingenuity. If I debated putting some videos in here, but I wasn't sure what Siska's policy was on, I don't know, animal brutality. But if anyone's interested in some very interesting ecological relationships, I highly recommend searching greater black-backed gull on YouTube eating, and they take down everything from starfish bigger than their head to full rabbits. So yeah, at your own risk. And then secondly, terns, they essentially they only eat fish that they dive for, more or less staying out of each other's way and being a bit less YouTube worthy in that sense, but just as cool. Here's one where when I was doing research into how First Nations related to them, I found incredibly interesting. There was research done with the Hoonets-Tlingit of Glacier Bay National Park up in Alaska, where they were looking at glaucous wing gull eggs, which glaucous wing gull is a species we get down here in the Salish Sea. It's our most common gull. But essentially the egg harvest for the Hoonets-Tlingit was this really big cultural touchstone. It marked the beginning of spring. It was something that the whole family would engage in, with kids as young as 7 or 8 being able to join them. But when the national park was set up, they were banned from collecting eggs in the 60s. Not to say they didn't, but it just created quite a bit of conflict with the park staff. Kind of under this narrative, which I'm sure we've all heard of, oh, we need to protect it's a park, we need to protect all the animals, et cetera, kind of ignoring that the Tlingit had been doing that and harvesting eggs there since, as far as we can tell, around 10,000 years, give or take. And when researchers went in to try and understand kind of how the harvest was going on, what they found was, I think, absolutely fascinating, which is that the Tlingit were breaking down into 2 groups. The majority of them were taught you can only take eggs from nests that have 1 to 2 eggs. And the other minority group were told you can only take eggs from nests with 3 eggs, and you can only take 1 or 2 eggs at a time. And when the researchers talked to the First Nations and talked to ornithologists to try and figure out what was going on, what they found was that what we understand of many gull species is that they will essentially lay 3 eggs. That's their go-to. And it doesn't matter if they've laid 5, they will keep laying until they have 3 eggs. And so First Nations who were saying that they would only collect from nests with 1 or 2 eggs, that was following the idea that if you took those 1 or 2 eggs, the gull would just continue to lay until they had 3. And similarly, if you took 1 or 2 eggs from a nest that had 3 eggs, the gull would still have an egg left. And even though it wouldn't lay more, it would still be able to successfully reproduce that season. And so as part of that, they were actually able to go back to parks and say, look, like this is, we have an incredible respect for these gulls. We're not here to destroy their population, but this is a really important cultural activity for us. And yeah, that was just, it probably shouldn't surprise anyone. You talk to people who've been doing something for 10,000 plus years, they've probably ironed out the kinks, but it's always cool when you see kind of ornithology and things like that come in and figure it out through their own way, I suppose, how First Nations have worked out these incredibly complex systems over the course of generations. But anyway, on to conservation. So globally, about 22% of all gull species fall somewhere between near threatened and critically endangered. Though interestingly, none have gone extinct in the last few hundred years, which actually surprised me a little bit. Here in BC, glaucous-winged gulls, which are the ones I mentioned, the Tlingit harvest up in Alaska, are actually discreetly kind of in decline, and we're not 100% sure why. A study between 1986 and 1999 looking at 14 breeding colonies found a 31% decline in what was 15 years, which, for wildlife populations, that's pretty insane. The running theories are it's some combination of bald eagle populations recovering from DDT, the human disturbance of nests leading to nest failure, and fish stock collapse leading to lack of food and nest failure because they're not able to feed their chicks enough. Another really interesting phenomenon that's been occurring is that as our herring stocks have been going down and as there've been less fish, bald eagle, which if you go back 20 years ago would pretty much exclusively eat fish, are all of a sudden saying like, okay, there's less fish around, what else can I start going for? And our rates of bald eagles predating gulls is skyrocketing. So just one of those kind of interesting ways that the way we, fish and meddle with ecosystems has consequences that we, would be pretty hard to have predicted. With regards to the where and when, they fall into pretty much every seasonal strategy you can imagine in the Salish Sea. This is just a sample of some of the ones that they go into. They use it as summer breeding grounds, so glaucous-winged gulls, migratory refueling in spring and fall migration, so Bonaparte's gulls, which I'm not showing here, but hold your horses for 1 sec, and overwintering and refueling over the winter, so Iceland gulls. To put that into perspective and visualize it a bit better, here we have California gull, which has a really interesting migration strategy, which essentially they breed on inland fresh water, following, from what I could find, mostly interior lakes following the rise and fall of lake levels. And then in the winter, kind of make a migratory group going up and down the Pacific coast, which we'll see one more time here, including large aggregations in the Salish Sea. Earlier, I guess in December, I was really lucky. I was in Port Renfrew, and just as a storm was coming in, and somewhere in the range of 3,000 California gulls all got blown in and were taking refuge from the storm there, just kind of right at, a couple feet away from me. That was quite cool. One fun thing I like to share about California gull. Does anyone want to guess? It's the state bird of one US state. Just quickly in the chat, does anyone want to guess which state that is? I have some prizes that I'll talk about later. If anyone happens to guess this, I will, except for Tessa. I know one of my friends in here who told me about this in the first place. You're not allowed. But if anyone wants to guess the state bird, California gull. Washington, Oregon, Texas, good guesses. Louisiana, seeing some interesting stuff here. I'll get 1 or 2 more guesses in here. Alaska, that'd be interesting. Montana. Norman, Montana is the closest because it is the state bird of, I lost it, Utah. And the reason for that is that in 1848, there was a massive invasion of Mormon crickets, which I don't know what they are, some type of crickets that were devastating the crops. And because these gulls do so well on interior lakes, they came in droves and ate out all of the Mormon crickets and basically saved the population from starvation. I see someone said Utah here. I'm not sure if that was before or after I said it. I'm going to assume after, but Melissa, well done. We'll chat about prizes later down the road. Anyway, yeah. So if you ever hear someone talk about California gull, you can remind them it could maybe be called a Utah gull. Yeah. Another species that has a really interesting strategy here, I mentioned before, are the Bonaparte's gulls. And the reason I share this one is because I think it really well shows how we work as a migratory pathway. So you can see here they occur throughout North America in the south, and then all at once move up through the continent into the Arctic, spend a huge amount of time here in the Salish Sea, making sure they can take advantage of our large fish populations and refuel. And yeah, if you're looking to see Bonaparte's gulls, I highly recommend active pass during spring and fall migration. They can show up in there in the thousands. I think some of our highest counts are up into the 20 to 40,000s around that area. So if you're paddling out there and you see a huge flock of gulls like this that have these kind of white tips, black lines, and kind of overall dainty, almost feathery flight, you've got onto something pretty special, and I envy you. Let's see. I realized I'd be remiss if I didn't really quickly show and mention really how important the herring spawn is. Herring spawns have been an opportunity for literally every representatives of every single group I have mentioned today to get together in the 5-digit tens of thousands to feast on them. This photo was taken here in Victoria of one glaucous winged gull that was taking down, I think, somewhere in the range of 9 herring. This would have been a fairly common occurrence into the early 1900s around here, but as many of you know, since then, herring stocks have collapsed on the South Vancouver Island, though they still are persisting up around Comox area, around Denman. I'm hoping to be up there later into March to be able to run some surveys on that. But yeah, I really felt it wouldn't be complete talking about gulls in the Salish Sea if I didn't talk about how important Pacific herring were. But yeah, I also just love showing those photos because they make me happy. So those are the 6 groups of seabirds I wanted to talk about. I hope that is a good enough basis to kind of whet people's appetite and give people a sense of what they might be looking at when they're on the water. When I had originally been looking at how I might do this presentation, I had thought about trying to teach people how to ID within different groups. And after speaking to some experts and trying to figure that out, I very quickly realized that that would be a 6 to 8 hour presentation. And so instead I thought, I'm going to show you kind of a highlight reel of some of the stuff in the Salish Sea. And then later on, I'm going to explain how you can take that to the next level to learn to ID those birds yourself using freely available tools and the like. So with that in mind, this is the second section of the presentation on seabirds and paddlers, which I've broken down into the 2 categories of how can paddlers avoid disturbing seabirds, so responsibly observe, and for those who are willing and interested, how can you go a step further and conserve seabirds? So with regards to disturbance, you can really break it down into the 2 general categories relevant to paddlers of disturbance at nest sites and disturbance either at sea or while birds are roosting. I don't think I think Siska's a pretty smart crowd. I don't think I need to convince many people that it's not a good thing to disturb nesting birds. But just to kind of give people, I guess, some ammunition in case you ever do need to have this argument, some reasons why disturbing nest sites can be so detrimental to seabird populations is that most seabirds choose those remote marine sites to avoid disturbance and have very low tolerance rates of large predators and threats. Many species have shown themselves to be unable to adapt when we introduce things like rats, cats, or even just walk on their islands too much because it's not part of their kind of evolutionary repertoire, if you will. And if they feel a nest site is unsafe, they can sometimes abandon their nest, thinking, look, I live 20 years, I live however many years, it's not worth it for me to get eaten to try and do this one time. Sometimes when the disturbance is too severe, they can even abandon eggs or even chicks, though that's not as common. And if that happens too late in the year, it'll be too late for them to re-nest, which means they essentially have had an unproductive reproductive year, which can obviously have pretty detrimental effects to a population. One reason I'm so grateful to be able to give this presentation right now is that, you know, if I were to give this presentation to school children or something, they're probably not going to be the ones who have any ability to get out to these islands. But as paddlers, you folks are the ones who are able to get out there and actually both observe what's going on, but also make sure that the way you're observing it isn't disturbing them. So kind of how you can avoid disturbing nest sites is pretty simple. Essentially, BC's done a really good job of setting up ecological reserves and protected areas. I think you'd have to go fairly out of your way to actively disturb nesting islands. But if you need help, the BC Marine Trails free online map, all those sites, we're not going to direct you to somewhere where there's active nesting. Similarly, any responsible map provider isn't going to tell people to land. And as best as you can do avoiding sites like that, obviously with the constraint of if it's an emergency and you need to get off the water, then there's pretty good justification for exceptions. But yeah, and one example of kind of where this has led to some impacts. So here in Victoria, the Chain Island system, which is actually a globally recognized important bird and biodiversity area. So one that I work with volunteers to monitor. And we've seen over the past, or I've heard from my volunteers, how over the past 20 years, more and more boaters have been going onto the island, disturbing nests, causing issues. And even though it is an ecological reserve and people, there's the signs telling people what not to do, kind of people think, oh, it's not that, birds can fly, I'm not going to disturb them too much, et cetera, et cetera. And I know these aren't, most of these people are not kayakers. I have seen that myself, but just to kind of give a sense of, why this is important. And if anyone wants one kind of, I guess, silver bullet for kind of why this is important, while researching this, I found a really interesting study in California on an island just off of one of their major cities, where researchers looked at the effects of people going and visiting that island over the course of the breeding season. And what they found is that every time people were going and causing the parents to flush and leave the chicks unattended, the ravens would actually come in and say like perfect opportunity and pick off a chick. And by the end of the season, they'd actually managed to eat every single cormorant chick on the island. And the cormorants had a 100% unsuccessful breeding season. That's obviously not hyperbolic, but one of the more extreme examples. But just to really drive home that there's responsibility in being some of the people who are able to get up to these islands. It's a huge privilege. Every time I've been able to, I've been incredibly grateful, and I hope people take that responsibility seriously, because it's like I said, it's a privilege. Let me see. So next, this one's not quite as intuitive, but what are the effects of disturbing birds either at sea or while roosting? I hear a lot of people kind of when we talk about things like this saying like, oh, they're birds, they'll fly. You hear that a lot in the bird photography world. Oh, whatever, they'll fly away, they'll be fine. But what people don't take into account is that many of the birds that we're viewing, that we're paddling near, that we're photographing, those are birds that are already, they're out there doing their best. It's cold. You got to dive for your food. Every once in a while, an eagle tries to eat you on alive. On top of this, you have to, every couple of months replace a huge number of your feathers so that you can fly effectively. You have to raise kids. It's just a huge number of different stressors. And then you throw things like pollutants and climate change and boat disturbance on top of it. It can all just become a little bit much. And the amount of energy it takes for those birds to fly away from someone, or when they're molting, like we said, and are unable to fly, dive to get away, can really start to add up and lead to really unhealthy outcomes for some of these populations. So if you're wondering, is it too big of a deal if I'm getting too close to birds for the photo or getting too close to observe them and they fly? In the single incident, no, but over the long run, if we all do this, it really will have effects on our seabird populations and their well-being. So how to respond to that? Appropriate setbacks. I had the incredible privilege when researching this to reach out to a few of my volunteers and friends to kind of say, what's the best message I can pass on? And what it came down to was a really, 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 really good research paper by Trudy Chatwin, Ruth Joy, and Alan Berger, where essentially they looked at how close different types of boats could get to roosting birds in different seasons and different species before the birds would fly away, to give us an idea of what sort of guidelines can we put in place to protect these birds. And they had some really interesting findings. You can see in the chart on the right here, they were looking at how close is too close. And what you can see here, the light blue, or sorry, the light gray line is how far from the seabirds a kayak was before that percentage of the birds flew away. So for example, at about 40 meters, you can see here, give or take 5% of birds have flown away, whereas at 10 meters in a kayak, about 80%. The darker gray line are motorboats. So as you can see here, you can see pretty clearly kayaks are less likely to disturb birds, but not as much as you'd expect. And what they found after doing this and consulting with policy experts alike was that 50 meters was the sort of recommended distance where you were disturbing the smallest number of birds without having to go too far out of your way. Now, because I don't believe in just giving people a hard and fast number and saying, go with it, I think people are smart. I think people, especially you folks, are able to kind of read these statistics and see how that can apply to you, whether you need to do more, whether you need to do less. I thought we could break that down a little bit. So again, as you can see here, kayaks and motorboats have differences, obviously. At that 50-meter recommendation, about 3% of birds were flying away from kayaks, while 8% of birds were flying away from motorboats. So you have about a 5%, give or take, margin of error there. With regards to time of year, they found that during the breeding season, birds were much less likely to flush. And when I say flush, because I'm going to say this a few times, what that means is take flight, run away from whatever it is, or fly away from whatever it is that's causing the disturbance. So during the breeding season, they're much less likely to flush than during the winter and migration seasons. That's pretty intuitive. They know that when they leave their chicks or eggs unattended, there's a chance predators could get them. There's a chance they'll get cold. It's more energy. They're probably spending more energy during that period to raise their chicks in the first place. So it's less likely to flush them, but when they do get flushed, they have a higher energy cost. It's more detrimental to them when that happens. So some other questions they looked at. Does where the kayaker or boater is affect how the birds respond? This one I found really interesting. They basically looked at areas of low boat traffic, medium boat traffic, and high boat traffic. And when I say boat traffic, that takes into account both motorboats and kayaks, though predominantly motorboats in a lot of the areas they were looking at. And what they found was that, as one might expect, the more remote you go, the more likely birds are to flush and fly away before you get close to them. That's pretty intuitive. If you're way up in Guayhanas or the west coast of Vancouver Island, where birds don't see boats as often, they're probably going to be more skittish, more ready to fly away. So you can see here what before was, let's see, 8 and 3%. So around, let's say, 5% of birds flying away at 50 meters. If you go to an incredibly remote area, is closer to about 19%. So another question they looked at was, how do different species respond? And this one was pretty clear. Most species respond similarly, with the exception of cormorants and harlequin duck, both of which we've talked about. Harlequin duck were the ones I showed with the kind of white all over the face and the beautiful patterning. Both of them will flush much farther than most other birds and seem to be more skittish, which was a really interesting finding, I thought. And so kind of what do we take away from this research into how paddlers and boaters more generally can most respectfully encounter these birds? Some takeaways: if you see a nest, avoiding it is best. Don't land where birds are nesting. If you're causing birds to leave their nest while there's chicks or eggs, or possibly abandoned where they'd already built a nest, that's pretty detrimental to them, and can endanger the chicks if they do take flight and there's predators in the area, or even if just the chicks are getting cold. Where possible, maintain 50 meters from birds. So if you're able to, keeping your distance so that the birds aren't flying and wasting energy, trying to get away from you, getting scared, things like that. The more remote you are, the more careful you can be. So I think I personally have seen this where when I'm out in more remote areas, I think, oh, people barely come here. I can act however I want. There's less people out here disturbing. And you kind of have to, I think, find where your comfort level lies in this. After reading this, I think it's given me a new perspective of, okay, when I'm more remote, I have an extra kind of burden of care to the birds I'm running into, because even though they might not be disturbed by humans as frequently, they're much more likely to be disturbed by humans. And if I, by going a little bit farther away or being a little less loud, can reduce that, that's something I want to do. And then lastly, giving extra grace to cormorants and harlequin ducks, specifically harlequin ducks, like we said, when they're molting in the fall, when they've finished breeding, they're tired. They just raised kids. A bunch of eagles tried to eat them. They got to all of a sudden change their whole wardrobe and take all their feathers out and replace them. They can't fly away. So if you run into any bird that doesn't seem to be able to fly away from you and keeps kind of swimming or kind of doing a bit of a hurried flight thing where they flap on top of the water, it's good to avoid them. And harlequin duck are just a really good example of that. But giving them a little extra space, because they seem to be fairly skittish and they're having a tough time. So those are kind of the broad takeaways of how to not disturb them. But as we know, conservation is the question of how not to disturb things, but also how to care for those things. And when I spoke with, it kind of came up organically in a number of conversations, some of which with people who have come to the talk today. So thank you for that. When I said I'll be speaking to paddlers, what message do you want me to pass on? They said, oh, paddlers, like people going to the west coast of Vancouver Island and into like islands in the Salish Sea. And I said, yeah. And they said, oh my goodness, if you could get those people to submit the odd eBird or iNaturalist or any observations, we don't know what's going on out there. People don't go out there. We need to keep better tabs on those areas. And that was across the board. And so I don't want to put pressure on people, but if you're willing to kind of take the next step, here are some ways that you can support bird conservation in the Salish Sea and beyond. So the first is eBird. A lot of the charts I was showing you, such as the graphs of when birds were in the Salish Sea during different times of year, such as the maps showing birds moving throughout North America, those are all produced from eBird. eBird is a free global database with over 750,000 users, which blows me away every time I read that. They have millions of records, are able to keep tabs on literally every species in every country all the time, as long as there are people willing to report. All you have to do to support it is to go out and say where you were, how long you were there, and what you saw. And for people who are worried about IDing what you saw, we'll get into that a little bit later, but there's a ton of resources out there. Like the birding community wants more people in it. They want to be welcoming. And I've yet to meet anyone who came forward saying, hey, I'd like to learn how to do this, that wasn't met with open arms. But yeah, some benefits you can get out of it. Like I said, submitting checklists, storing photos. I personally had my hard drive crash back in 2019. And some of the photos that are actually used today, the only reason I have them is because I'd uploaded them to eBird. And those photos are used by researchers to figure out everything from when different species are molting a different time of year to what species of moth were in the clutches of different falcons in Asia. Like it really goes across the board. You can track life lists. So for people who really kind of drink the Kool-Aid with birding, it gets pretty fun of trying to see, how many birds you've seen in BC, how many birds you've seen in Canada, how many birds you've seen overall. And it can get quite addicting. I recommend hesitantly people look into that if you have a listing mindset. But even if you don't, there's a lot of value for you there. And then overall, you really just contribute to the largest avian community science database on Earth. I can't stress enough how many organizations rely on this data. Even in my own work with important bird areas, how many times we're relying on people submitting eBird checklists to understand how areas are changing, how populations are moving, where we need to be focusing our efforts more. So yeah, huge amount of opportunity here, and I highly recommend people checking out ebird.com for ways to get involved. For a little less intensive way, we have iNaturalist. I've shared here a screenshot of kind of the very broad scale view of where observations have been made in BC. I love this map. I'm a huge fan. iNaturalist is a little less intensive than eBird. I'm sure many of you have heard of it, if not used it already. You get to submit individual observations, but on the same time, they're less informative. We're not getting a sense of what you did and didn't see. We're just saying, okay, there was at least one of these things. But then the benefit is every time you submit something, you plug into a community of, something like 1 million naturalists who jump on and say, well, I have my PhD in ants from Barcelona, and I can help you figure out that ant you saw on that island in the middle of the Salish Sea. It gets pretty wild. The number of specialized naturalists I know all over North America who've helped me figure out everything from slime molds to ants to, all that. It's pretty cool. And like I was saying with paddlers, one thing that's so cool about it is that, we really have huge coastal data gaps. You look at just, for example, BC's park system. There's been a huge push, as many of you have probably seen since around 2018-19, to have the UVic and BC Parks team go out and submit INET observations to get kind of snapshots of what species are in which parks. And many of our coastal sites that really paddlers are the only ones consistently going to are just so poorly covered. And to give an example of that, I'm hoping to plan a trip into the northwest corner of Vancouver Island by motorboat, because I would drown if I did that in a kayak, to do some surveys for areas where we don't have much bird data since the 90s, but also pop by some of those parks to help the BC Parks and UVic team get some sightings there. And of the, I believe it was 48 or so protected areas between Heshkiat and Port Hardy, there were 25 with fewer than 50 sightings. So 50 people who taken photos of moss and bugs and whatever, and 10 with 0 sightings, which for reference, Strathcona Provincial Park has 24,478 sightings. So many of our parks on land get much better coverage. And I know for a fact there are many people in the BC Parks team who, if they started seeing data coming in from these places, would get very excited very quick. Not to mention, it'd be pretty cool to kind of see what species we're missing out there. But yeah. So again, all you need to do to use iNaturalist is take a photo with either your phone or a camera or whatever, and then upload it later saying where and when it was. And then teams of, naturalists will come on and start saying, oh, I can see this gill here. This must be this type of fish. It's a pretty cool process. I recommend for anyone interested in naturalism generally. For something less paddler specific, but more general, people who are looking to get involved in bird conservation at all, I recommend going with some local NGOs. I know some of my colleagues from Birds Canada are actually here today, but they have a whole host of really cool volunteer opportunities. The easiest one is the Christmas bird count. You basically just sign up and the coordinators will pair you with teams of experienced bird watchers. And then somewhere in the December-January window, you go out and just count all the birds you can see, and you get to be part of, I think it's the longest running community science project ever, if not in North America, but over 100 years. And that data has helped us look at how climate change has affected hundreds of species, how land use change affects those species, and get really wide scale look at how different populations are doing and how we can support them. The second thing with Birds Canada that I would recommend for paddlers is the Coastal Waterbird Survey. That's, again, qualified birders going out on the second Sunday of every month. You get partnered with someone who knows what they're doing and is really good at it and can teach you how to ID some of the species I've been talking about today. And yeah, you just count what you see. And the results of that have been really interesting insights into how different populations are faring in the Salish Sea, in the outer coast, and the north coast. And yeah, again, keeping tabs on how populations are doing and how we should respond. And then kind of the, no commitment, really high interest, really cool opportunity way of getting involved in bird conservation, banding stations. They are the best kept secret in the bird conservation world. I've listed a couple here in the Salish Sea. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 more, but I've worked with Rocky Point. They're fantastic. They have volunteer or visitor days where you get to go and see birds in hand. And at a minimum, if anyone ever has the time, I highly recommend going out for their northern saw-whet owl banding visitor days, where you get to give them a little scratch on the head and see these cute little fist-sized owls up close in a way that I won't guarantee you won't see in the wild, but it'll be pretty hard to get views anywhere near this good, and almost impossible to do so ethically. Anyhow, so that's kind of the wrap up of how to support bird conservation should you be interested. To wrap up, so supporting BC Marine Trails, 3 ways I've outlined to do this. First is becoming a member. It's affordable. You get access to an amazing community. You help support the work we do in stewardship, First Nations engagement, marine safety. Volunteer, or members can also volunteer for any of our committees if you kind of hear something I've been talking about and feel really passionate about that. Secondly is donating. You can go to the BC Marine Trail site and either donate generally or into any of the pools that help us do the work that we do. And thirdly, joining a local club. You know, paddlers and local club, you're why we do what we do. If it weren't for you, we'd be a bunch of schmucks making a map for no reason. So, you know, if you're not already a member of Siska and you are interested in paddling in the area, I highly, highly recommend it. Similarly, it's affordable. I think it's $40 for individuals, $6 for families, and it helps some more support doing presentations like we're doing today, gear swaps like was being mentioned before, or sorry, not gear swaps, but kind of, you know, getting a foothold in the paddling world. And yeah. And then I also like to just quickly thank the people, some of the funders who made this possible. So like I said, the Trans-Canada Trail, who funded our ability to do the research into this, promote it, and speak to clubs, as well as the Real Estate Foundation of BC, who funds our First Nations work since 2019 now. I also specifically wanted to thank my colleagues at Birds Canada, who gave me some pointers on how I could hone this into being a more interesting and useful presentation for paddlers, and specifically Melissa Hafting, who is not with Birds Canada, but who was immeasurably helpful in helping me track down the sort of disparate First Nations links into into how First Nations have worked with birds since time immemorial. Without her, this would be a much sparser presentation, or I would have had to work a lot harder either way. And yeah, so I put a little page here for further information, just to give people ideas of where you can go if you want to keep learning about bird, pardon me. If you want to keep learning about bird conservation, if you want to keep learning about how to ID birds, Merlin is a free app. You can put a photo in and it'll tell you with pretty good consistency what that bird is. You can also pull up a pack and see where what's expected in your area from what times of year. I think it's invaluable. I'm amazed that it's free. Birds of the World is kind of the next level. It's a subscription-based service, but you can pick any species on Earth and it'll give you a summary of all published research on it ever, which is just amazing for something like 30 or 40 bucks a year. eBird, like I was mentioning, Siska, we are hoping to do a paddling trip sometime in April where I'll be going out and hopefully you all will keep me from drowning and I will be able to point out some birds and talk a bit more about what we've been talking about here. IBA Canada, that's the organization I work for. You can go and see where the globally significant sites in your area are. It's just so you can see if there's something in your backyard. I always find that pretty rewarding. And then What's This Bird? It's a great Facebook group run by the American Birding Association where you can post a photo, a description, a recording anywhere in North America. And literally within seconds, teams of experts come on and start debating whether or not what you've seen is a harlequin duck or a surf scoter or whatever. So if you're looking for ID help, I'm going to loop back to this page, but I wanted to quickly share as well. I'm going to put the link to this in the chat. Again, because we have funding from Trans-Canada Trail, I was able to get 4 copies of this book here, Birds of British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest. I put together a little Google form asking people to kind of summarize what you thought about this presentation, some things you learned, some questions you might have. And I'm going to put that in the chat right now, as well as ask Siska to share it afterwards. But if you could fill that out, if you're interested in being entered to win one of those, just put your email in there and I'll do a little raffle in about a week or so's time and ship those out within Canada. Otherwise, we'll sort out shipping outside of Canada. But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Siska. Thank you everyone for paying attention. I hope I didn't ramble about birds too much. I'll put this slide up just so people can quickly see what I was talking about again. And yeah, I think you should have my email, but like I said, if there's continuing, we'll go through some questions now. But if you have bigger questions, feel free to email me. I now realize that I didn't format the slide properly and it's actually out of slide, so I'll put that in the chat as well. But yeah, thank you very much.
Wow, Liam, my head hurts just a little bit here. I'm glad there's no quiz, but what a pleasure listening to somebody who's so passionate talk about birds. And I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else did. Have you got enough energy to look at some of the chat questions?
Yep. Just pulling it up now. I'm trying to go through what's a question and what's.
Yeah, lots of congrats, and we can let you enjoy the back pats later. But if there's something there, I did see a couple go by.
Maybe get
Yeah.
Liam to put the link in first.
Yes, I'll put that link in now.
All right, you go ahead, Liam, and I'll find the first one that's a genuine question here for you, other than just kind of additional information. So just mention this while you're putting your items in. There is just some information in there about cormorants and what people saw in various places. I don't think we'll stop with that, but there is a question here might be useful. It's Sean's. If you're finding the list now, Liam as well, where were the introduced population of Canada geese introduced from?
Oh, so that's a really interesting story. It's fairly complicated, but basically what a lot of people don't realize is Canada geese almost went extinct in the early 1900s. They were delicious. They were kind of considered a Thanksgiving and Christmas treat, and they got hunted pretty far down. And in a lot of North America, what brought them back was a U.S. Parks-led program, or maybe it was parks, maybe it was conservation and lands, where basically you could mail in and you would build a hutch in your backyard and they would mail you Canada goose eggs. And you could then hatch those Canada goose eggs because it seemed like a great idea. We needed more Canada geese, when really the problem was maybe we should stop shooting them as much. And so they took, I don't remember, I think it's from the Mississippi population, and put them everywhere. And these geese kind of grew up and went, wait a minute, this isn't the Mississippi. I don't know where to go from here. And we ended up with these sedentary populations that mill about in our grass all winter or all summer. And yeah. But if you ever see the kind of smaller and much darker, almost purplish, they're so dark, Canada geese, those are the ones that are native here. You'll often see them in huge flocks during migration, and sometimes in winter.
Okay, so you'll want to read Morley's post because it's complicated. I'm going to leave you to do that. But Jenny Sutton's asking about interbreeding of gulls. It's hard to tell what type you're looking at.
Yes, that is a very good point. Like I said, I didn't want to get too into the weeds here. I may have already pushed a little far into the weeds. Gulls they're challenging to ID. I think once you have someone who really knows their stuff walking you through it, you start to realize like, oh, people make this sound harder than it is. But there are some really interesting dynamics that go on specifically in the Salish Sea of different populations that will breed with one another and create hybrids. For that, I would recommend Rocky Point. They have a really, really good presentation with someone who knows a hell of a lot more about gulls than I do, and why that's happening in this area, if it's an issue, things like that. But yeah, there are many, many hybrids. And actually, if anyone knows the other Liam in Victoria, Liam Singh, he's a wizard with that sort of stuff. He'll pick out juvenile herring, Iceland gull hybrids that are he's nuts.
Can I interject, Liam? I think maybe the survey hasn't been set for the public.
No, I think I did. I'll send it again.
Oh, okay. Somebody said they couldn't get access. I'm not sure.
Oh.
Okay, Karen, I think it is asking if you could comment on herring and whether they should just stop taking herring for a number of years.
That's a tricky one. Again, I work with birds, and I recognize that it is an incredibly complicated question. I think I would love to be able to say that, oh yeah, we'll just stop fishing herring and everything will be fine. I know similarly, there's a lot of livelihoods that depend on that. I know it's a much more complicated question. It strikes me as someone with, a bit of background in ecology that it doesn't seem like a great idea to fish out the bottom of your food chain. But at the same time, I would defer. There's a lot of people out there who are more qualified to answer that question. Yeah. Okay,
here's one I think is maybe useful for people. I think it's Jenny again commenting, there are bird behaviors that warn kayakers that they're getting too close. Any comment on that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. So as with all birds, they don't want to fly just out of the blue. They'll typically start to give some signs of when they may or may not be stressed. It varies between species. I know with owls, it's one thing that people talk about a lot, because some owls, when they're stressed, their response is, I'm going to huddle up and I'm going to close my eyes as if I'm sleeping. And people go, oh my God, that's so cute. It's having a nap. I'm going to go really close to it. And meanwhile, the owl is there thinking like, oh my God, this is the most stressful day of my life. And so, I think it's one of those things that is kind of hard to verbalize. But if you see birds having an obvious negative reaction, that's a pretty good indication that you can maybe give it a little bit more space, move a little bit slower, make a little less noise. But yeah. Also, just a quick note on the form. I think I might have accidentally said it so only people in BCMT could answer that. I'm fixing that
I
right
just
now.
changed it, Liam.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay.
My apologies.
Okay, so you don't have to be a BCMT member to answer it, but hey, we suggest you join anyway.
Yeah.
There's a question here which is maybe useful for you. Do you do school presentations, Liam?
I've done 1 or 2 in the past. Like I said, I would definitely want to tailor the material a bit more to school kids and would be happy to do that. I would also direct people to some of the local banding operations who are just absolute rock stars at working at kids. I was showing that photo of them holding the owl. A lot of those organizations have people they can go to bring a hawk in, bring birds in to show the kids. I can wax lyrical about an eagle all day long, but you show a bunch of 5-year-olds an eagle on your arm, that's a whole other situation.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, that's all the ones I see. Oh, here's one. Why do great blue herons always pick up and fly in the direction we're paddling? That's a good question. I've noticed that. I don't know what that's about.
Yeah, I get the same thing with kingfishers when I'm on boats. I think it's just them not, because you can imagine most predators and things that might disturb a bird, they're either following the bird directly, in which case that's one thing, or they're kind of doing their own thing and they're just trying to get out of the way. But because humans were thinking, I'm going to follow this coastline, I'm going to take a really nice trajectory, we're just accidentally we keep being like, oh damn, like just go the other way. I say that to kingfishers all the time, like, I'm not trying to make you fly away, I'm sorry, I just need to go this way. But yeah. Someone did comment as well here, Victoria Natural History Society does do school bird talks and walks. Again, there's someone I would direct people to. They're really good. I'm popping my email in the chat here in case I miss any questions. Feel free to send those to me afterwards. And I will be happy to.
Still having trouble with that form. We'll let you guys sort that out later. But anybody then, we've gone through the chat here. Any sort of burning questions that haven't come up? You haven't typed them out?
Alan, I did have something there, but I didn't put a question mark. Liam, are there signs up at the Great Chain Islet? I haven't ever seen one from a kayak.
When was the last time you were there? Because I was putting some up last summer.
Oh, yeah, in the last 6 months.
Yeah, because there were a few historically that were up. They got blown over. And then we went back with new signs and concrete blocks and put some up. Actually, it would have been last April because it was on my birthday.
Okay, well, I'll look for them.
Yeah, send a photo if you see them. If they're gone, I gotta find out who took them. It'd be pretty hard to haul those concrete blocks out of there, but I guess people have done weirder things.
Here, what's your favorite bird to observe while paddling, Liam? That must be a tough choice for a guy like you.
That is a really good question, Chris. For those interested, Chris was the one I was mentioning who got the really, really cool footage of the 1,000 surf scooter train. If anyone wants to check out his Instagram, hell of a lot better than mine, would recommend. My favorite bird to observe while paddling, it's a little bit here. Let me pull one up and I can show a photo of it while I talk. Short-billed gull, which formerly called mew gulls, in case that doesn't ring a bell. Oh, yeah. It's something about their behavior. Here, I'll share my screen real quick, so I'm not just talking about gulls. It's something about their behavior. They just have this kind of dainty sort of flight. They have this really unique way, I think, of moving around. And I found the few times I've been around them in a kayak, they just, I don't know, they just have a lot of personality. They're a bird I really love to watch. And I can't really get enough of them. Plus they look really funny like this and kind of like the birds from Finding Nemo. So that helps. I see a question here from Don Scott. Do the eagles just use the signposts as perches to pick out their next meal? Eagles aren't as far as I know, they're not a ambush predator, so they don't need a perch the way a great horned owl or something would. They're just as happy, as far as I understand, to be on land and kind of surprise things that way, because they don't need to kind of drop down to get momentum and surprise things as much as others. If you're interested in kind of looking into that, if you look it up, Grasslands National Park had a really interesting problem with this, with great horned owls, because they were trying to reintroduce sage grouse and they kept putting up these signs being like, looky here, there's sage grouse. And then all these owls will come in and go, what a perfect sign, I can eat sage grouse from this. And so they have these incredibly complicated wire and spike things atop every sign to not just create a great horned owl killing field. So I don't think it's an issue for eagles, but I could be wrong. Are oyster catchers in a different group? I didn't see them in your presentation, from Lisa Lasagna. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right. Yeah, so oyster catchers are part of the shorebirds group. That's one that I had considered putting in here, but is really hard to ID, incredibly diverse, and one that most birders aren't going to run into very often. My catch was oyster catchers because I do know that birders specifically with oyster catchers run into them a fair bit. I don't know, maybe I'll have to do another presentation specific to shorebirds, but
Okay, well, that seems like a good place to draw a line. I think that this could go on for a long time. I'm noticing that we have over 70 people, sort of paying attention to your questions and answers, Liam. So I think you succeeded. We have almost, I think we had 90 at one time and for the presentation itself. Really, really a pleasure. So I'm going to ask Fred if he will come on and thank you properly. Fred?
So Liam, thank you for a really informative and educational presentation. You mentioned the oyster catcher. I'm not a birder very much, but it's the one bird that I do know and recognize. And there are a lot of them out there. I see them all the time when I'm out paddling. In order to say thank you to Liam, what we're going to give him is one of our much sought after BC mugs. And I'll make sure our Siska mug. And I'll make sure that you get that, Liam. Liam's kind of stole the thunder a little bit because I was going to announce the paddle that he's going to be on in the spring. The details aren't worked out yet, and Jenny is coordinating it. Liam is kind of new to the West Coast, so he doesn't have the gear and the wetsuits, dry suits, and the boats yet. But we'll outfit him, put him in a double, and it'll be up to Jenny and Liam to work out the number of people that can join him. And maybe we'll make a West Coast paddler out of Liam. I think he'll enjoy the trip. And I know the people going out will certainly appreciate it. One of the things that I learned tonight, Liam, I'm a kayak photographer. And in the past, some of the ways that I get pictures is by paddling as close up to I can to birds. So my behavior is going to change after what you shared with us tonight. So thank you very much for doing that.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it.
I want to talk a little bit about next month's presentation. Ellen has already mentioned that we're going to be at the Garth Homer Center. Garth Homer Center, the meeting place there is gigantic. It's absolutely huge. It's almost the size of 2 or 3 basketball courts. I mean, we could get all of our Siska members in there and still have 20 feet separating each one of us. So if people have concerns about social distancing, it shouldn't be much of an issue. A lot of us in the Siska group have gone into the Esquimalt Harbor and have paddled by Coal Island and have seen the buildings that they have been renovating there. Hopefully next month, we're going to have the Coal Island Preservation Society come and do a presentation on the history of Coal Island and the ammunition storage buildings that they're renovating. So we'll firm up those details and be sending out notices later on. Again, Liam, thank you very much. And back to you, Alan.
Great. Thanks, Fred. Thank you, Liam. And thank you, Marine Trails, Paul, and your board. We've appreciated having you with us. Anybody else who's joined us from outside Siska and Victoria, we sure appreciate that. We hope we'll be able to continue sharing these things with you as other clubs have shared with us. And it's really enriched, I think, our whole experience of kayaking. So another good one. Thank you so much, Liam. I'll be trying to get on that paddle of yours, but we'll see how that works out in due course. Okay, thanks everybody. I'll just wait for people to wave goodbye and I'll shut it down in due course.
Kim?
Thanks, Liam. That was awesome.
Thanks so much. That was very great.
Glad you enjoyed it. Have a great night, everyone.